Welcome to the Robotics Through Science Fiction podcast. I'm Robin Murphy, and in this podcast, I'll talk about Sanjeev and Robotwallah, a short story by Ian McDonald in the We Robots anthology edited by Alan Castor. The story's a moving exploration of why teleoperating drones is hard, and not just because of the user interfaces. Sanjeev and Robotwallah almost broke my heart. It's the story of an Indian boy who adores a group of military drone pilots who are barely more than boys themselves. The group of pilots, sporting their anime-inspired uniforms and boy band swagger, teleoperate ground and aerial robots through virtual reality rigs in order to suppress a civil war that no one seems to understand. And then one day, the war's over. The realism of the pilot's experiences and how it mirrors what real pilots go through is what tugged at my heart. I've served on science boards for the Department of Defense, and since the late 1990s, we could see that unmanned aerial vehicles like Predators were going to be the way of the future. The Air Force wasn't wild about them, having a culture that glorified the jet pilots who were out there out front, assuming all the risk. Pilots who stayed back at base, relatively safe and warm, just weren't real pilots. The drone pilots wore flight suits but went into a trailer, earning, mocking commands about did they need a parachute to get out of the trailer and were they prepared for the air conditioning to depressurize. It was so uncool to be a drone pilot. And then 9/11 happened, and the U.S. began operations in Afghanistan, and the CIA weaponized drones, and suddenly the action wasn't in fighter jets, it was in drones. Instead of mocking drone pilots, officers at the Air Force Academy started asking to be trained as drone pilots. The Army saw small drones as a way of having immediate air reconnaissance without having to ask the Air Force. As an aside, I once witnessed a rather pointed exchange between two generals. One, an Army general, was trying to explain to a scientist that the Army needed drones because whenever you called for air support from the Air Force, it was usually too late. The Air Force general icily replied that it took a lot of coordination not to get shot down by the very group that had requested them. But no matter, now drones and drone pilots were sexy and fighter pilots were so old school. I've watched various DoD officials chortle that the war would now be like Ender's Game, a video game writ large. And many of us with human factors backgrounds began to warn that this was not necessarily a good thing. If you recall Ender's Game, everyone barely escaped being convicted of war crimes, and Ender personally didn't cope so well with having killed at a distance. And sure enough, videos started circulating of drone pilots shooting their targets, also known as people, lots of times, firing way more than was necessary, and generally acting like they were in some sort of a Grand Theft Auto session. One of my colleagues, an expert in human factors, shook her head sadly and said something like, this killing's going to eventually catch up with these pilots, and when it hits them, it's going to be bad. You might want to think about setting up counseling because they're going to need it. Oh, no, it's just like video games, they'll be fine, was the response. And no, it's not. One day, when they realize that they've been shooting up real people, not animations, and whooping and high-fiving while they did it, they're going to have psychological problems. And sure enough, reports began to surface that drone pilots were encountering a version of PTSD. And then we began to see other reports that the drone pilots were being expected to work long shifts, 12 hours or more, despite studies that indicated that teleoperation was much more fatiguing than regular operations. And we heard about how isolated the drone pilots were, that the long hours interfered with their family life, but their isolated work and long offers offered them little opportunities from camaraderie with the other pilots. So neither fish nor fowl, drone pilots occupied a new niche in the soldier ecology, and they were stressed out whether they knew it or not, just like the robot operators in Sanjeev and Robotwallah. And I felt bad, and I still do, because our country had set these pilots up for failure. And Ian McDonald has captured this, all the glory, the ruinous effects of being a drone pilot, plus the cultural twist of a civil war in India. Read the story, it's great. And then read the latest about drone pilots in the 2016 New York Times article, The Wounds of the Drone Warrior, and weep for our supposed victories. If you want to learn more about teleoperation, there's a chapter in my new book, Robotics Through Science Fiction, Artificial Intelligence Explained Through 6 Classic Robot Stories. Plus, be sure and subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel so you won't miss a thing.